Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Underneath the old stone bridge, in the summer heat, I first met my friend. I'd come to this spot beneath the bridge for as long as I could remember, following the small creek in our backyard down through the farmers' fields and behind the roaring freeway. Beneath the bridge, the dirt was still cool, even in the hottest noonday sun. I'd come to the bridge to think, to play, to cry, and to press my pale, chubby fingers into the blessed cool soil, digging deep depressions in the damp earth. The creek trickled by, but my father had told me never to go in the water. It had a thin scum on the top that reflected the light in an odd, shimmering way, like the shell of a beetle. I disobeyed him once when I was younger, and the rash that boiled up on my legs had scabbed and bled for a week. Now, I was content to sit among the pale and drying reeds, to hold tight to that primal cold in the place where the sun couldn't reach. On the day he was first there, the cottonwood trees were shedding their seeds, bright white silken clouds that drifted in the air like snow defying the sun. The air was thick with heat and exhaust from the freeway, buzzing over the rise like an angry hive. He lay stretched out on the other side of the creek, his body half covered by the shadow of the old stone bridge. At first I saw only a pile of ragged clothes, capped with a wide-brimmed and frayed hat. But then I saw the long, bony fingers steepled across his chest, and his calloused and blackened feet. Tied to his big toe with a perfect bow was a thin line of fishing wire, and I saw the toe twitching, tugging on the line. The hat covered his face, but beneath it, I caught the quick dance of a frayed stick or root, grasped between his teeth, sliding back and forth under the shadow of the brim. I watched him for an hour, nothing moving but his toe, the stick, and the slow rise and fall of his chest. I didn't move or make a sound that I was aware of, but soon the stick stopped its rhythmic journey and tilted upward, tucking under the brim of the hat. I saw the outline of his pale lips and teeth as they dug in and pushed the stick upwards, lifting the filthy hat upwards like a cellar door. He peered out, straight at me, and blinked in the sunlight. The rest of his body lay still. He was gaunt and hollow-cheeked, his skin weathered and tanned like leather. As his bright sunken eyes met mine, his mouth split into a wide grin, showing a row of perfect and polished white teeth clamped around the twig. It was infectious, and I found my own face stretching into a smile. I could have stayed there, smiling with him until the day went dark. I felt content. When he relaxed his mouth and allowed the hat to drop back over his face, it was so slow that I hardly noticed the movement, until the shining coals of his eyes vanished beneath the brim. As soon as the hat obscured his bristled chin, it began to rise again, revealing cheeks puffed out like a trumpet player and eyes crossed tight together. I laughed out loud, feeling a warm wellspring of happiness inside me. The hat dropped and rose again. This time his face was puckered, like he'd eaten a lemon. I laughed harder. After a parade of distorted faces that left my lungs sore from laughing, he leaned forward and rose to a crouch. He removed his hat, running his hands through a thick mop of unkempt black hair. He smiled again at me, chewing on the twig, and began to twirl his feet around each other in a little waltz, coiling the fishing line around his toes. The hook slid out of the water, dragging with it a little sparkling tangle of gold that caught the sun and ignited. Once he'd drawn the hook up to his feet, he reached down and clasped his hand over it like it was a bug. His face took on an exaggerated impression of fear, as he pretended that it was leaping in his hands, trying to escape as he struggled against it. I couldn't help myself, and I burst out laughing again, and my friend flashed his wide smile. He mimed throwing underhand until I understood and held out my hands, cupped and expectant. The little tangle of gold sailed in an arc across the glistening, filthy water and landed perfectly in my hands with a sound like shifting sand. It was a beautiful necklace with a tiny golden gross encrusted with sparkling green stones. I looked up and my friend winked, the skin around his eyes crinkling and pulling, and he raised one thin, bony finger to his puckered lips. I understood and looked back to the beautiful little gift. When I looked up again, he was gone. I didn't know the girl who was missing, but she was my age, and I must have seen at school. It made me angry to see people who didn't know her crying and carrying on like they were the best of friends. I tried not to scowl at the little bawling clusters of kids in the hallways and fingered the little gold chain in my pocket. I was dreaming of summer break, a scant 2 weeks away, and thinking about my friend when I fell, my fat, clumsy feet wrapping around each other, pitching my body forward in a wave of inertia. I threw my hands out, but only succeeded in throwing the little gold charm and bending my fingers back against the hard marble floor. It didn't take long for the little crowds of mourners to break their stage play of grief to laugh at me, sprawled on the floor with watering eyes. All except one dark-haired girl with puffy, wet eyes. She was staring at the necklace on the floor, with a look that I didn't understand, blank, yawning, and broken. Then she looked at me and screamed. I understood then, but even as the principal and later the policeman questioned me, I played dumb. I told him I'd found the necklace outside of school that morning, repeating the story with clever little details I made sure to keep consistent. My friend had given me a gift, and I owed it to him to keep the secret. I wasn't like the pretenders in the hall. I don't care about some missing girl I never knew about, and who would have never cared for me. I care about my friends. It was months before I saw him again, in the beginning of autumn. He was perched on top of the old stone bridge, his filthy feet swaying like an excited child. I hadn't been let outside for the whole summer, trapped in the dry, air-conditioned dark of the house as my father drank and my mother cried at each new disappearance. Most of the missing meant nothing to me, but those few whose names I recognized made me smile in secret. They were the worst, the ones that beat me, taunted me, and called me names, the ones that laughed, and I knew that I would be safe. It made such perfect sense that I wanted to share it with my parents, to assure them that it was only the bad people, that it was all okay. But I saw in my mother's blasted eyes the same lying, phony grief from my school. I saw her taking someone else's pain and using it to plug the holes in her own emptiness, and it made me sick. When I finally felt like I was going to burst, so angry at them all for not recognizing the gift, I snuck out into the evening cool, leaving my snoring father and hollow mother and racing along the creek. Somehow I knew he would be there, but my heart still leapt to see him. His clothes were the same, if only more tattered and dirty, and he appeared to have the same wet and shredded stick tucked between his thin lips. He smiled wide at me, and I sat beneath the bridge in contented quiet, relishing the company of someone who simply understood and asked no more. In a wordless conversation, he showed me how he could crack the knuckles of his toes just by shifting them quickly, playing a crackling little rhythm of pops and ticks as his feet shuddered and wiggled. I laughed as he juggled a pair of apples and a large dusty stone, taking a bite out of each apple as it passed his mouth, and miming a painful bite from the rock. The sun set and the stars pierced the sky. He was showing me how he could fold those long fingers into the shape of a flying bird when I heard shouts, crying my name far in the distance. My friend turned to me with a little wink and then dropped from the bridge, landing almost silently in the dirt beside me. He crouched, his shining smile and papery skin just a few feet from me, and I smelled a sweet, warm smell like cloves and cinnamon. His hand darted out towards my ear like a striking rattlesnake, and his face was a clown's mask of surprise and shock. He twisted his hand with a flourish to reveal a key ring, packed with a bouquet of dozens of keys, brass, silver, chrome, shining in the starlight. The key ring fell into my outstretched hands, and as I turned it over again, I thought how lucky I was to have a true friend at last. Then he was gone, and my father's hands were on my shoulders, shaking me and yelling. A group of a half a dozen men, my father's friends and important men in town, clustered around him, gripping lanterns and rifles, huddling close together, their wide faces reflecting fear and moonlight as their eyes darted at each noise. I wanted to laugh at them, feeling that warmth in my chest as I saw what it looked like when bad people were afraid, at last. So much is changing for the better, and I have my friend to thank for it. The key ring was heavy in my pocket, hidden from them and my father's drunken anger, I clasped it tight so that it was perfectly silent, a reassuring weight in my stubby fingers. Later in the night, as my father and his cowering posse combed the countryside for what I knew they would never find, my mother covered me in crocodile tears and breathless constrictor hugs. It was only the little weight of the gift in my pocket that kept me from being sick with contempt. When the winter came, the roads were blocked, and no one could have left town if they'd wanted to. The food grew scarce, and soon there weren't enough of my father's friends to patrol the town, and the vanishings and disappearances spiked. I confess that I was surprised at how truly rotten the town must have been, but I trusted my friend. He knew what was right. The keyring kept me alive. While my mother and father doled out the last portions of dried rice and beans, I passed unseen through the silent white town to find a treasure trove of locked larders and pantries. My friend was wise, as well as benevolent. I considered sharing this gift with my parents, but if they were meant to be chosen, my friend would have let me know. So I stayed warm and fed, and my parents grew thin and drawn. One morning I awoke to the pure silence of winter, the snow robbing the world of all sound. The usual movements and shuffle of my parents were gone, and even the creaking bones of our old house were silent. There was a sudden swell of happiness in me, like a youthful Christmas morning, before I was told it was all a lie. I danced through the empty house, no longer trying not to smile, no longer holding back my joy, because I knew the gift was complete now. I pulled on my snow boots and jacket and burst out into the silent world, purged of evil, emptied of predators, cleansed of all that was wrong. My friend was at the bridge, sitting cross-legged in the cobblestone road. He was covered in snow. It hid his entire hat under a broad cone of white, and it crested up against his sides like frozen waves. His broad, shining smile rivaled my own, and his skin was flushed with warmth. When I approached him, he stood slow and elegant, like a tree growing in front of my eyes, and I noticed for the first time how very tall he was. When he'd risen to his full height, he stretched, in exaggerated pantomime, complete with a yawn that stretched the corners of his wide mouth. Then he leaned forward and pressed something into my hands, something cold and hard, and his long fingers wrapped around my little hands like a spider. I clenched it tight, not wanting to take my eyes off him, knowing that his work was done, and this meeting would be bittersweet and final. He smiled warmly at me, winked one last time, and hoisted a filthy burlap sack to his shoulder. A few feet down the road, he turned and tipped his hat to me, sending a little flurry of snow down that obscured his face. And then he was gone, swallowed up into the swirling whiteness. I opened my hands slowly, watching the bluish fingers curl away from the last gift, and my heart's warmth flooded through my body, and hot little tears formed at the corners of my eye. My parents' wedding bands, tarnished and simple, lay in my hand. The rings were somehow impossibly linked and intertwined. I stood in the unbroken quiet and perfect drifts of snow and looked out at the world, the silence, the freedom, the perfect and beautiful loneliness. This was the true gift. This was my friend's work, and he asked nothing in return. All I can do is to someday try and return the favor.
I know this road better than I know myself. I know each of Interstate 85's 250-odd miles. I know that it takes me an average of 3 hours and 26 minutes to drive west from Charlotte from Atlanta, and an average of 3 hours and 29 minutes to make the same trip going eastward. I know the price of gas at a dozen stands, and the closing hours of each fast food shack and greasy diner. I know the curves of each low hill, and I know each stand of pine and oak trees. I know the stretching dark of the long winter nights and the wet heat of the summer breeze. I know these things well because they are the totality of my existence now. I know the names of each exit, westward and east. Batesville, Poplar Springs, Spartanburg. They tick through my head as I pass, but the Silver Creek Road exit is never among them. In 3 years of this endless loop, it has never appeared again. If I ever begin to doubt that it will, then I have nothing left. The Silver Creek Road exit doesn't exist on any map, or at least it no longer does. It may have once, but like the road itself, it has been razed from the earth and from all memory and record. At the beginning, I spent long, anxious days poring over old surveying maps and neighborhood planning documents, searching in vain for any sign of the road or the exit I knew I had taken. When there was nothing left in the libraries and city halls to comb through, no meek county official left to interrogate, wide-eyed and frothing, then I began the drive. I've been through 2 cars and have burned through my savings and now survive off a stack of rapidly vanishing credit cards. I have no address to receive bills and no intention of paying, and have been filling my trunk with small plastic gallon jugs of gas while the cards are still accepted. When this filthy and battered Oldsmobile gives up the ghost at last, I suppose I will have to learn to hitchhike. I've been through 2 cars and have burned through my savings and now survive off a stack of rapidly vanishing credit cards. I have no address to receive bills and no intention of paying, and have been filling my trunk with small plastic gallon jugs of gas while the cards are still accepted. When this filthy and battered Oldsmobile gives up the ghost at last, I suppose I will have to learn to hitchhike. I first took the Silver Creek Road exit 3 summers ago, on that last night that I was with Bobby. I have in my head just a few frozen frames of that ride left, her black curls bouncing like springs in the evening breeze, her gapped-toothed and freckled smile, and the slow summer crossing into night. We'd made that drive together a dozen times, between our apartment in Atlanta and her brother in Charlotte. There was nothing remarkable that night. We simply ran low on gas and took the first exit we came across. I remember vividly passing beneath the green and sparkling white letters of the exit sign and onto the sharp curve of the road. The street turned perpendicular from the light and noise of the highway into the inky darkness of the pine trees. Nothing remarkable to separate it from 100 other country roads, but as the lights of the car penetrated the darkness, a vague and trembling unease passed through me. The tall, rustling pines seemed black, even under the blue-white of the headlamps, and the road began to rapidly degrade, becoming pocked and uneven just a few dozen yards in. All the roar and glare from the highway seemed swallowed up behind us, and there were no lights ahead of us for as far as we could see. My insides felt tight and knotted, and I turned to Bobby. She had her skinny legs tucked them to her chest and looked at me, quizzically, one eyebrow raised, with a small, crooked smile. Her small bravery seemed to dissipate the chill that had been steadily rising in me. I looked forward to the road. I felt a sudden sharp pressure on my chest. Stretching out in front of the light of the headlamps, the road ended. There was a small field of shattered asphalt slabs, and then the forest swallowed up every trace under a blanket of rotting pine needles. Something twinkled brightly between the trees, and I strained to pick it out of the darkness. It was the smooth chrome of a bumper, attached to a pitted and rusting car, completely enclosed by the towering pines. A wave of panic and disorientation crawled down my scalp and my knuckles went white on the wheel. Bobby placed her hand on my shoulder and gently squeezed once. "Cal," she said, firm and evenly, "we need to turn around now, honey." There was a tremulous quality to the last word, as the surreal darkness seemed to further constrict around us. I heard her take a little gasp of air. I began to turn the wheel when I realized how narrow the road had become. It had been 2 lanes when we started. I was sure of this, but the forest seemed to be pressing against both sides of the car, far too narrow to turn around. Blood pounded in my temples, and I threw the car into reverse. The boughs of the trees scraped against both sides, soft whispering scratches from the needles and the soft thuds of thicker branches. Bobby held her hand on my knee, calming and reassuring even as panic threatened to overwhelm me. I could see the highway moments later, a thin cloud of hazy illumination over the rise behind us, and the forest seemed to part like a curtain. Bobby released her held breath and giggled softly, and I felt a wave of elation wash over me. I turned to her to share relieved smiles, and I locked with her dark eyes when the siren sounded, once and sharp in the silence, and bright blue and red strobes flashed through the window. The police cruiser was parked in the center of the road, crouched low and silent like a predator. The familiar red and blue flicker bathed the street in weird, crooked shadows. As I turned off the engine, there was the slam of a car door, and I could hear the heavy thud of boots on the road, pacing towards us. The comforting normalcy of the sight of a police officer began to drain away as he approached in the dark. He carried no flashlight. and I saw his gloved hands hanging straight at his sides in the side mirror as he walked towards me. He was dressed in thick winter wear, with his high collar turned up and his hat pulled low. He approached the window, and as he leaned straight from the waist to fix his black and beady eyes on mine, I realized just how thin and tall he was. License and registration. His voice was muffled and thick with a strange and choked drawl, almost unintelligible, and his lips seemed to move in a manner counter to the shape of his words. The summer night air around him seemed to grow even warmer. There were no sounds, no wind in the pines, no chirp of insects. I was mesmerized by the strangeness of what seemed, for all the world, to be an absurd imitation of a man. For the second time in as many minutes, I wondered fleetingly if I was dreaming. I could see now that he had no badge and was simply dressed in unremarkable black clothes. The overwhelming fog of dread and panic seemed to condense all at once around me, and the singular animal command to flee at once drove my hands forward towards the keys. He was quicker. One black-gloved fist slammed into my temple, and a shower of stars exploded over my left eye, and the world tipped sideways. I remember him dragging me from the car, the shocking heat in his grasp seeming almost to burn. I remember hearing Bobby's screams and seeing in dizzy glimpses of her brief flight before being swept into those inhumanly long and slender arms. One glove came off in the struggle, and I saw the pale white hand, like an immense knobby spider, each leg tipped with a black and curved talon. The world swam around me, wild and burning, and I struggled to move my limbs. Bobby was limp in his arms as he approached me again, and I struggled weakly to my feet. Our eyes met in the red and blue strobe. He looked nothing like a man now. His once pale mockery of humanity was stretching and distending away into some unthinkable shape. He did a very human thing then, and smiled, lips peeling back to reveal rows of thin white needles. I was running before I knew it, bolting dizzy and weaving down the road. I was vaulting across the shoulder of the highway when my rational mind clawed its way to the surface. "Coward!" it screeched at me. My legs shuddered to stop, and sudden painful guilt flooded my lungs like fluid and stole my breath. Bobby's face loomed in my vision, and I felt a profound and clear shame pressing down on me. That's when the car struck me, sliding on locked and screeching tires. I was tossed into the concrete median, striking the back of my skull. I woke up 3 days later, wrapped in plaster and flooded with morphine. Gaffney, Blacksburg, Kings Mountain. The exits passed by, each one decreasing the chance of seeing Silver Creek Road exit on this go-around. It was impossible to accept in those first few days of maddening research that Silver Creek Road had simply vanished, and so I made the drive myself, carefully reading each sign. When it failed to manifest itself, I made the drive again, this time at night. And then again. Sometimes there's a zen-like quality to the repetition, the familiar patterns of predictability and order. The immutable order of the land, the locked procession of towns and trees is comforting as it continues to grind my hope away like a millstone. Most days, I can believe and accept that Bobby is gone. There is always that shadow of doubt, that crystalline thread of hope, but it feels hollow in my hands now. There is one thing I must believe. If it appeared to us once, it will to me again. And if I can find it, that pale horror in a man's skin, I will kill it. If the bullets fail, I need only a few moments to ignite the trunk's cargo and to lure the murdering thing to me. I swear to the stars, I will never stop looking.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.